evening, wherever you are. I'm physically here, which I'm very happy about. So I was told to talk a little bit about my more recent work in education and in language acquisition and development instead of my more cognitive work. So this is a special year because this year, 2025, also marks the 20th year of since my first publication. I feel kind of old, but I also feel kind of grateful for meeting a lot of new people and changing my trajectory in research. So here on this slide, I will talk about language or learning differences, considering linguistic diversity in education in general, but more specifically in special education. These are my funding bodies, and I wanted to give a word to the two American funding agencies that are currently under threat. NIH and IES. IES is a research branch of the Department of Education in the United States. I think yesterday, 50% of the workforce was cut from the Department of Education. What they do is to support special education around the country and also have a direct research branch like the IES to support education research. So I just want to say that. My Canadian funding agencies are awesome. How do I advance? Okay, so thank you, Patrick, for the introduction. You know a little bit about this already. I started off as a psychology graduate student. I got my PhD in developmental and cognitive processes in psychology at York University. And then I did my postdoctoral training at Baycrest Hospital, which is a geriatric hospital. So I studied aging and neuroscience. And then my first faculty position was in the US, and I decided to go back to Canada, and currently I'm at McGill University. And so as you can see, it's actually not very usual that people have three different fields in a fairly short span of career. I do what I want, and I'm a very free-spirited person. I just go whatever my feeling trains me. So today you will see some work in Canada, but most of my work on education and special education was done in the United States. And I will explain to you why this is important that you understand the linguistic context in the United States. And I also differentiated the talk. So I gave a talk last week or 2 weeks ago, I don't even remember, in Florida online while I was here. And that part deals a little bit more about the policy context of special education and multilingualism. So if you're interested, the host actually shared the link with me. My talk was at about 55-minute mark, but there are other talks that are really interesting as well. I can share my slides with you later. And so why is it important that we contextualize linguistic experiences across countries, across different contexts? At the time I wrote this talk, there was no official language in the United States. Not anymore. Since I arrived here, there apparently the president signed an executive order making English the official language in the United States. Things are changing. I can't keep up, so I can only give you what's updated. But regardless, official language or not, in the United States, English is the lingua franca. Almost everybody speaks English, some plus another language. The dominant instructional language at schools is English by default. Many multilinguals or heritage speakers, they are multilingual, but they may not be multiliterate. So one thing I want to point out is multilingualism and multiliteracy are not equivalent, okay? In Canada, where I originally trained and currently in, it's federally bilingual. English and French are two official languages at the country level, but there are a lot of provincial differences. For example, in the province I'm in Quebec, French is the official language. So if you go to government agency, go to see a doctor, you're supposed to speak French, okay? English and French are taught in school across the country, and immersion schools are very, very popular, although the quality varies a lot. And if you're interested in this line of work, I have recommendation readings and things like that. We could talk after the talk. And so in Canada, the situation is slightly different, where we have many people who are multilingual, and they're also partially multiliterate. And I say this is because there are a lot of heritage speakers, for example. They know how to speak the language, but not necessarily how to read. But generally speaking, people who can speak English and French or also be able to read English and French. So in today's talk, I'll walk you through a little bit of what I call a non-linear roadmap of language experience and special education. The first bullet point here is a very brief summary of what I gave in the Florida talk. So if you want to learn more about the policy aspect of it, you can watch that talk. But for this particular audience, I think I'll just give you an overview and then we can go deeper on other things. So first, I'll introduce you the policy and education context. Then I'll say a little bit about language experiences and learning. How do we differentiate the two? And why we need transdisciplinary research. And what does that mean to do a transdisciplinary research? And then I'll share a little bit of a next question we could ask, and hopefully will inspire you to ask questions that are relevant to real life, and also being accountable for the participant that we study. And I myself is a multilingual, so there you go. Okay, in the early days, I wanted to share a little bit of this research with you so that you know where we're coming from. 1923, roughly about 100 years ago, we do have some really interesting research findings on bilingualism. Framing such experience will lead to significant inferiority, and this inferiority will also become persistently larger as children grow older. Okay, that's published in 1923. It might be triggering for you because it's not okay to talk about things like that, but apparently 100 years ago is okay. And these line of research lead to terms like mental confusion because of multiple languages in your mind that we still hear today. Like when I give talks in community, this is sometimes I hear about from parents, from concerned parents about, I don't want to introduce another language, or I don't want my child to speak the heritage language because they might be confused, right? So what we need to say, or in response, is that we have the capacity to be multilingual because our brain is plastics, which I'll show you a little bit of my neuroscience research. And closer to North America, in the 30s, there's a line of research showing that Spanish-speaking children are academically inferior than children who only speak English. Now, think about it. If you speak Spanish at home, but you go to school in English, of course, it's going to be more effortful. But don't forget that there's also a lot of socioeconomic status confound with minoritized language in United States. So in the paper by Manuel, published in 1935, the terms like language handicap emerges. So we still hear these terms today. I just want to demonstrate that that's the origins of where these terms come from. What about education? How does multilingualism manifest in education, particularly in the United States? Now, as researchers, I'm not going to lie, I like black and white because it's economically speaking, it's the simplest and most elegant design that you can make a difference. You have two groups of people that you believe in being different, and then you compare them. If they show differences, then you get your outcome, right? But truth of the matter is, we know bilingualism is not categorical, right? That's actually a title of a paper that I published in 2013. There's a lot of great gradient scale, and I'm not a good artist, so this is only unidimensional, but truth of the matter is bilingualism is like a spectrum of sphere spectrum. And in education, particularly in American education, multilingualism is actually not the focus, right? So they have a lot of different terms that they call children who are in the process of developing English as an additional language. I think that's the term used in England. And depending on who is in power, and some people may use terms that are a little bit more deficit framing, like limited English proficient, without attending to the linguistic resources that they could bring from the heritage language. Recently, we have terms like emergent bilingual or dual language learners, which are a little bit more neutral and less deficit framing. And then you have a group of children, the system called English proficient, right? But truth of the matter is a lot of the bilingual children are also English proficient. So in a lot of education research, if you look at education data, you actually don't have the clear monolingual, bilingual differentiation like we do in research. So that's a mismatch between lab-based research and policy findings. So who are the English learners in the United States? This is data from 2021. The darker the color means there are more children in that state that who are English learners. So there are children who are in the process of learning English. And so technically speaking, they represent usually around 10% of the population, which is about 5 million, not a trivial number at all. And unlike some political claims, most of the English learners are actually born in the United States, meaning that they have every right as the citizens of the United States to receive quality and equitable education. Spanish is the most representative, but there are also many other languages represented in this sample. They usually congregate in urban elementary school, but in certain states, we also see a lot of them in rural areas because of migrant workers. They have very high dropout rate at the high school level. And in some states where they identify with gifted education, they are very under-identified. And most of them come from low-income background. I have some example to show you. And importantly, they're very often misrepresented in special education. So special education is a category in which children are deemed as needing extra support in learning. And so that will be our focus of the talk today. So I'll give you a lay of the land very quickly. So why do I say multilingualism or English proficiency is associated with demographic factors? So I sometimes use data that I don't collect, but collected by the state Department of Education. For example, this is a data set from 2019. If you look at grade 3 to 5, and then we actually looked at data up to grade 8 in a northeastern state. Sample size is not trivial, 215,000. And I put them into 4 groups based on the data that I have my hands on. For those whose parents reported their first language is English, nothing more. They might be bilingual, we don't know. And then for parents who reported that their first language is not English, but they have never been an English learners, meaning that they're proficient in English and another language to begin with, or they are former English learners, meaning that they were English learners, but their English proficiency received a competence level that they get reclassified, or they're current English learners, right? Bless you. So in a way, typically speaking, we would say in education, we would say English proficient students, so included the 3 groups I have in the green box versus English learners. So that's the typical education research categories that you see with this type of work coming from the United States. But in reality, in research, in our line of research in psycholinguistics or cognitive science, these are what we call the bilinguals, right? So there's the mismatch. I just want to show you that in this state level data set that we also see this mismatch. Okay, so what does that mean? Multilingualism is often associated with socio-demographic factors. So this is a line of work led by a colleague of mine at Emory University, Brianna Yamasaki. And in this northeastern state, we know multilingualism is associated with socio-demographic factors because we looked at whether they have been ever being an English learners and what's the proportion of students in that category are classified as economic disadvantage. Okay, economic disadvantage is a term used by the school system to determine whether families come from a lower income background. versus not. So the blue color is not, the pink is. So in the third grade level, we have close to 70,000 children, and the wider band in this mosaic graphs indicates the children who have never been an English learners, and the narrow band indicates that the children who had at one point in the school system been an English learners. So without even doing a chi-square test, you can see that they're overrepresented in economic disadvantage, roughly about 70%, versus in the children who are never been English learners, roughly about 20%. So you say, okay, maybe just one grade. We looked at grade 5 and grade 8 as well, and the pattern is the same. And I've been tracking these statistics since about 2013-14 up until 2019. I think we just got data from 2021. The pattern has remained the same in the last 10 years, at least in the state that I did my work. Okay, so in a moved on to a different state in the South, we had a very nice agreement with the state level Department of Education. And they gave us 10 years of data. So the question we want to know at the policy level is, across these 10 years span from 2009 to 2019, are there fluctuations in how likely children with different English proficiency get identified for special education? So this is work done by my close colleague in Ginem and Sia Martine and Minhu, who is a postdoc at UVA. And so on this graph here, the horizontal axis are the academic year from 2009 to 2019. The black line is always stay at 1. We calculate the odds ratio, which is like a probability relative to native English speakers, how likely you are to be identified needing special education. The blue line that is always under the black line is the English proficient bilinguals. And the orange line is the current English learners. So it seems like, oh, the current English learners seems to be on par with the native English speakers. Should be okay, right? But even though the blue line is consistently under-identified. And truth of the matter is there's no reason to believe that bilingual children have a more propensity to be identified as learning disabled. So why do we have that discrepancy? So we looked into this line of work a little bit deeper, and we found that in the 2 categories that are specifically related to language processing, such as specific learning disability and speech or language impairments, the blue line are consistently under-identified, whereas the orange line is consistently over-identified. So there should not be a reason to have this pattern of results. Now, at the policy level, this state stated that if the difference in point is less than 3, it should not be a worry. So that even though everything is statistically significant, we cannot say that these children are misclassified, because at the policy level, it is not. And what about other categories? So we picked the other 3 categories: intellectual disability, other health impairments, and autism. Interesting fact, ADHD is in other health impairments, okay? And in these 3 levels, the bilingual children, the English proficient bilinguals, and the current English learners are consistently under-identified. Okay, so it seems like English proficiency really matters at the policy level of how they're being identified for special education. And truth of the matter is, it's actually nationally represented that across all the categories, including the ones that I just showed you in one state, nationally, we see that English learners are over-identified in the language-related learning disability categories, but not in the other categories. Okay, so what we know so far, it's a crash course in 5 minutes about the special education in the United States. Multilingualism is a complex phenomenon in the US, heavily intertwined with systemic factors such as socioeconomic status. Okay, and special education eligibility and identifications are modulated by multilingual experience and socioeconomic status. And multilingualism is differentially represented or misrepresented in different special education categories, specifically over-identified in language-related categories, but under-identified in other categories. So so far, that's what we know at the national level. Good, okay, so far, so good. And finally, what matters is English proficiency matters because that seems to be the only language marker that people use to measure whether you can learn or not. Now, what I can't show you is at the education system, what are the obstacles? For example, the overrepresented of English monolingual teaching force and the lack of resources of supporting educators to identify language acquisition trajectories. So they receive very little support in these areas. Okay, so I hope I will be able to share with you that line of work later. Okay, so now we get to the question. Do we believe that being multilingual actually makes you learn less? So we can answer this question. So we have to start thinking about theory of change of multilingualism. What makes multilingual different from learning just one language? Again, we go to the context, but because we're talking about children, we want to look at the two contexts that are most relevant to their daily experiences, which would be home and school. At home, if you come from a diverse language home, for example, then your language experience will be very dynamic. And it's also opportunistic. Depending on who you're speaking to, what you're talking about, you may be using different languages if your family is multilingual, right? So in my family, my son and I most of the time talk in English. Sometimes we use Cantonese. Sometimes we use French because we don't want other people to understand us. But when I reprimand him in multiple languages to make sure that he knows what I'm saying and that I'm very serious. Like Cantonese first, calling his name, including his surname, and then followed by English to make sure he understands, because otherwise he would say, like, I don't know what you're talking about. So in the home, when you interact with language, it is supposed to be dynamic and it is opportunistic. And that also means that there's variable level of input into a multilingual child, and the outcome is expected to be variable, right? What's the other situation that children spend a lot of time in when they learn to read? Literacy learning. So in this situation, in school, instructions are not supposed to be individualized unless you have a special tutor, right? So it's supposed to be an educator working with a group of children. So it's collective. And pedagogy is supposed to be structured as well. It's purposeful. So at every single unit, every module, or at the end of the year, there's always competency level that is expected. The educator expects children to reach at a certain competency level. So relatively speaking, the input level is quite consistent, but there's still a variable outcome. But that level of variability in outcome should not surpass the boundaries between monolinguals and bilinguals because their learning environment are common, right? But surprisingly, people rarely think of children's language acquisition in this way. So I looked into my data sets and realized I actually have data to look at this. So people typically look at home language environment versus language outcome, and then school language environment and language outcomes. They rarely actually combine it together. So this is a smaller data set that I have in the United States in adolescents 11 to 15. We collected in Boston. Children are all educated in English. Nobody is in a bilingual education. And some of them have what they call world language class, which is like an hour a week or something to learn how to speak a word of Spanish. So I just told you that at home, that's where the variability is in terms of input. So that's where we typically see vocabulary differences in English, the first versus the second language in children. And that's what we replicated using a picture vocabulary task. So the bilingual children speak Spanish as a first language and English as a second language. Not only there's a group difference, but their performance is much more variable. Okay, that's consistent with the literature. And then I use another task, also a standardized task and letter word ID. In this task, what children do is look at letters or words and then name them out. And that is relevant to classroom word learning experiences. And in this case, there's no group difference. Okay. All right. Just one data set, kind of small. Let's look at going to Canada. In Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, most children are educated in both English and French. There's no way I can have monolinguals because in some countries, monolingual is just not easy to find. We collected data during COVID, and I looked at the data sets that have a picture vocabulary test like oral, spoken language or vocabulary. And in this data set, we have teenagers and kids. Okay, so great. During COVID, we know that the teenagers know more words than the kids. Sanity check, because you get really nervous for whatever data you collect during COVID. And in this case, we also have the language group difference, that children who speak English as their first language know more words in vocabulary than children who speak English as a second language. Okay, that also makes sense because it replicates the literature. But when I look at word reading, again, in this case, I should not expect to see a difference between language groups because they share the same learning environment. And we don't see the language group difference. And sanity check, the teens can read more words than the children, which is great. Okay. All right. I should be satisfied, but I'm not. And I'm going to go look for some longitudinal evidence because that would be the biggest piece of evidence to say when the environment is controlled for, is common across children, we should not be able to find differences. So we follow children. This is a very large project following children from 3 years old to 4th grade. But I'm only going to show you data from kindergarten to 3rd grade, because then when their learning environments is shared, right? And sample is not trivial, 625 longitudinal sample, meaning that we have data from all these time points across time, even though disrupted by COVID, age from 5 to 9, kindergarten to 3rd grade. Roughly half of them come from Spanish-speaking homes with English usage as well, and half of them are English-only homes. I did not go out there to collect data from monolingual and bilingual children. This is a naturalistic sample that happens in South Central US. And majority of the children, I think 97% of them, also come from low-income homes. Okay, so that means SES is also roughly controlled for. They're equal. I'm not going to say control for it because I did not. They're equally represented in the language group. So I gave them standardized assessment. And I say I, is not really me. It's like a team of really great researchers. And we're going to look at the raw scores. So again, today I won't be able to talk about what standardized score means for multilingual children. If you're interested, we could talk about it later. Raw scores are basically just raw score that you get from between the basal and ceiling set in a standardized test. Okay. So with these 625 children, K-3, including COVID, again, we replicated the findings that for children who speak English as a first language, they have higher level of vocabulary across time before and after COVID, looking at the raw score. Do you want to guess what the result is for word learning? Identical. So now I'm quite convinced. So I think it's great that we demonstrate that when the learning environment, when the input is relatively comparable, there's no learning differences as an outcome. And my former student, Sibila Leon Guerrero, also did a really nice study showing that there's cross-language positive influence in Spanish-speaking adolescents. So for children who speak Spanish as their first language, many parents always worry about, oh, if they speak Spanish too well, then maybe they're giving up their English. But language learning is not like a seesaw, right? For people who speak 3 or 4 languages, you can't really balance it out like that. So what Sevilla did is a really nice study that looks at these children who speak Spanish as a first language and have them read English and Spanish texts that are used by school in the different gradation level. So the red line that you see, the steepest line, is a fourth quartile of the texts that have the most complex clause complexity as the highest level. And for that, if the children are actually doing well in Spanish close reading, they're also doing better in English. So what you learn when you're doing better in one language is actually positively influencing your learning in the other language, okay? And this is a study not only in behavioral, but it also eye tracking data. So what about doing more exploratory study? So I keep talking about special education, children with learning disability, but I haven't shown you any data. And I'll tell you why I can't show you any data. In this exploratory study, we have three groups: L1 Spanish typical reader, L1 English atypical reader. So these are children who are identified with special needs in reading, particularly in reading, and L1 English a typical reader. Okay, they all have the green group, the L1 English atypical reader group, they all have support, extra support from schools and clear identification at the school level or from neuropsychologists. First, I'm going to show you the SES representation. Like the mosaic graph I showed you before, the children who speak Spanish as a first language are represented highly in economic disadvantage group, just like the data I show you at the state level. Okay, what it means is this sample that we recruited is very representative of the state's socio-demographic level and in terms of their language background. And so you may wonder, why do you only have three groups? Logically, in a research design, you should have the fourth group with bilingual children who are not a good reader, right? Yes, you nodded, so you think, yeah, you're missing a group here. I can't do that because in the entire country, actually, particularly in the state where I did the work, there were only 300 children who were double identified as English learners and children with special needs. 300 in the entire state across from kindergarten to 12th grades. There is no way I can recruit those children for a study like this. And I also do not have the ability to do the identification and diagnostic myself because I'm not a clinician. And that is exactly the question we're trying to find out is it second language learning or is it learning disability? So we're in a conundrum here. And so I decided to just stick with the three groups that I'm very confident about the group affiliation. So then what is the theoretical framework that we use as an exploratory study? You guys familiar with the simple views of reading? Okay, it's SVR is a model that is I think it started off in the 80s and then it's kind of blossomed until here. It's very simple. It's really, truly simple. And because it's so simple that it's popular. And in this model is purported that word recognition times language comprehension, which is the way you understand oral spoken language, reaches reading comprehension. Okay. So I hear from a lot of educators saying that, oh, the SVR is not appropriate for multilingual children. Right? So what would academic do when they actually question the validity of a model? So I went to the paper back in the 90s. This is a 1990 paper by Hoover and Goh, who originally proposed this model. And in this model, they're actually using 254 bilingual children. So the origin of this model is actually from bilingual children. So they can't question whether the model is actually appropriate for multilingual students. And the reason why they use bilingual students is because they need the variability in both recognition and language comprehension in order to get the product, which I thought it was nice. Okay, so in a study that we did in Canada, we found that, yeah, simple views of reading is an appropriate model to represent children's reading development. it's more appropriate for younger children than for teenagers. So in this model here, we show that for teenagers, the percentage or the R square of the model drop about half. Okay, so this model is great and it's simple, but it does have a developmental consideration, but we can still use it because it's still a significant model. And so going back to this exploratory study, this is just a very busy graph. I shouldn't have included this to to give you the confidence that these three groups are the groups that I'm very confident about, whether they're bilingual children without learning disability, English only speaking children with learning disability, and English speaking children who have no learning disability. And so they're all confirmed by different levels of task. I think I'm gonna skip this graph. This is the first time I've done it in my talk that I decided to not talk about the task. What I wanted to show here is we do different type of analysis using discordant functions to demonstrate which cluster of assessment would differentiate this group. And the ideal situation is to have the bilingual children, the red and the blue are more together and separate from the green, because we just want to identify and isolate the children with reading difficulty. And memory seems to work out okay. Phonological works much better, but it's the sequencing fluency that works the best. So in the sequencing fluency test, that's the cluster where you see the red and the blue circles are closer together with the green more separated. So we'll follow up in this line of work very soon. So what we know so far, bilingual children do not learn less than monolingual children when the learning environment is shared. When you compare language outcomes that are about home, about oral spoken language, that is more about the diversity in the home, and of course you find differences. And there are differentiable component skills in reading that we can use to differentiate children who may need time to learn more, to learn the second language, or children with reading difficulty. This is particular in reading. And in the very small scale study that I did, we know that children with reading difficulty struggle with word recognition, which is one component of this model. Bilingual children is in the process of acquiring the oral comprehension skills in their second language, and these are differentiable skills that we could use for identification. So then, why do we need transdisciplinary research? And it's such a loaded term that, like, what are you talking about? So I'll tell you what I'm talking about. So why do I use neuroscience? Why do I go so far away from where I should be very comfortable in to do something new? Neuroscience is a very useful and have a lot of potential to show us what neuroscience and learning, how the brain learns in the context of education, okay? And it pushes us to step away from relative comparisons. Even in my own research, using behavioral assessment and outcomes, I'm constantly comparing groups. And I can't walk away from that. But if we use neuroscience, we don't always have a better brain or worse brain. But there are different networks of brain functions, but they're not necessarily better or worse brain. So we can step away from this relative comparison in our narrative, and in order to understand process or mechanisms. And the question should be inspired by educational challenge, which is what I've been telling you, that I'm very interested in differentiating language development from learning disability. And we can also use ecologically relevant task and analysis. So we don't always have to show people a word and have them decide whether it's a real word or not. In artificial paradigm, we can actually turn a task to be a little bit more, we have less control, but we have more ecologically relevance to draw upon the processes that we believe are underlying the actual behavior in learning in school. So we developed this paradigm in which we have a subject. So this smiley face is my subject. We asked them something about earth science, and of course we excluded people who are in geography or in a domain that we know they will know a lot about earth science. And then they typically say, well, I kind of learned it in high school, but I forgot what it is. which is great. Those are exactly the kind of participants we want. And then we put them in a scanner and show them a video that we developed, which I have the next slide to show you how we developed it. No brain is hurt. Like everybody's brains fit into the scanner. I just don't know how to make this better. I have very limited artistic skill, but you get the idea, right? And then when they came off the scanner, we did several things. We asked them to tell us what you've learned from the video. And we recorded the speech and then transcribe it using Clan, and we document the elements that they told us. And we also asked them specific questions about the video, very similar to what a teacher would do, but not in a written way. So it's not an exam, but it's in an oral language, because we have children who struggle with reading. If we then give them a reading task, we know they're not going to do well. So why do we want to do that? So we turn everything into spoken language. And the outcome is quite clear, that the children who speak Spanish as a first language and the children who speak English as the first language but struggle with reading have similar comprehension performance level, lower than 70%. And they're both significantly lower than the L1 English speaking children with no reading difficulty. Okay, so that's pretty nice. And then how do we develop this type of, what video did we show them? I keep talking about being relevant in real life. So we took a framework, a learning framework from the Department of Education, and we first wrote a script just to write down the information that we want the video to have. And then we turn it into a script that a teacher would use, because we know as researchers, the way we write is not really how real people speak. And then we had a teacher record it in a video that she would have used in her classroom. So she is actually a middle school teacher teaching science in a linguistically diverse area. And then we sit together and discuss what the question and the rubric should be like in grading how much they know. And then we develop these questions accordingly. So that gave us a video. This is an in-house production. We produce the whole thing ourselves. The speaker is always on one side, and on the other side, there's always an image, a 2D image, not three-dimensional, and there's no motion. And we make sure every time she records the video, she's wearing the same t-shirt and her hair is the same and everything. So the video is about 6.5 minutes long. And that's when the children, and we also have adults do this in a scanner. And then you may say, who have been into an MRI scanner before? Okay, what do you hear in the MRI scanner? Basically, that's what you hear for 45 minutes. And so what we did was to give them in-ear headphones so that they can hear the narration. And then we give them the overhead headphone to block off the noise. It's not perfect, but it's as good as we could do it, okay? I'm not saying that what I do is ecologically valid. You may pay attention to what I say. I'm not saying that it's ecologically valid, but it's ecologically relevant. Okay, in terms of speech production, not surprisingly, the groups are not very different in a lot of these speech production output. We turn everything in Clan, and the only metric is the moving window type token ratio, showing that the L1 Spanish speaking children have a smaller type token ratio compared to the other groups. And there's no other group difference, which makes sense, right? It's also mirror what we show behaviorally at the receptive level. So here I'm just showing you the 3 images, the 3 videos of the 3 groups when they're watching the science video without any predetermined seed or functional analysis, just overall brain activations. So in a nutshell, you can see for the children who speak English as a first language, they have the least amount of activation, so to speak, right? And for children who speak Spanish, they have relatively more. So there's more activation in the visual cortex, there's more activation in the front part of their brain. And the children who speak English as a first language, but who are atypical readers, kind of in the middle, right? So we're going to hone in on that and check out, okay, why is it processed? Okay, so then we couldn't publish the data, including children with learning disability, because sample size is really small. They moved a lot in a scanner, we cannot use a lot of the data. But for the L1 English and L1 Spanish group, we publish the data in scientific reports. So just to show you in a little bit more detail, the kind of analysis we do is we pick the seeds, particularly based on the meta-analysis that the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is in the front part of the left hemisphere, we compare the groups speaking English or Spanish as their first language, and it shows that it's the same what you see before, but more clarified that at the whole brain level, these brain areas show correlating brain activity with the activity in the front part of the brain. And that's the brain, some people call it Broca's area, where it is responsible for syntactic or sequencing processing. And the other region of interest is the MTG, the medial temporal gyrus. And in this area, we suppose that if they're all listening to videos, that should be similar behavior. And again, we show that, yes, they use the same brain areas, but the L1 Spanish speakers use more of the bilateral. There's more bilateral functional connectivity compared to the L1 English speakers are more unilateral in the left hemisphere. Okay, so that's what we reported in the paper. And when we looked at the children with reading difficulty, particularly in the LIFG, in the left frontal areas, we see that their brain activation is right in the middle. So you see a relatively large distributed network in the L1 Spanish speaking children when they're listening to these lessons in their second language, and the L1 speaking children, English speaking children are not as diverse. And the L1 English speaking children with atypical reading performance, they're in the middle. So that's where the gradation is. If we run a group comparison, we will find no significant group difference because they're all in gradation. So we need to find something a little bit more advanced so that we can show differences, even though I think the important point is the fundamental brain areas responsible for learning new information should be similar across the three groups. We cannot always be looking out for differences because that's not how the real world works. Should we teach all three groups of children differently because of how their brain review different activity? No. So I actually think it makes sense that they're not that much different. They have very specific differences at the brain network, but fundamentally the learning mechanism is the same. Okay. All right, I'm almost done. So you may say, that's only brain function. What about brain structure? We did look at brain structure. In a group of adults, we asked them, at what age did you start learning your second most proficient language? And we found that in the corpus callosum area, we found that the earlier they learned their second most proficient language, they have a higher level of fractional anisotrophy, which is consistent with my aging study published many years ago. And what about the teenagers? We also found something similar, although it's a slightly posterior. In this model, we control for biological sex at birth, parental education, age, and nonverbal IQ, and they're all corrected statistically. We found the region that correlate with when they start learning English on top of Spanish is a little bit more posterior. Okay. So not only multilingualism has functional relevance when they're learning new information, it does change your brain structurally. So we're happy to find that, which is consistent with what you typically see in the literature. So where do we go next? Why do we need transdisciplinary? So transdisciplinary research is a term that I use because thinking about the career trajectory in my case, I learn new things at every single stop of the way. So I become this person who kind of connects people together. I'm not an expert in any of three. I don't feel like it, but I try to work with people who are experts so that I can converge these lines of knowledge and create new knowledge. And I'm only these three circles, and in this room, I know many of you have different expertise. So the question is, how do we bring people together and train the next generation of researchers, not only being disciplinary rigorous, but also transdisciplinary relevant to the real world? So I really enjoy doing this, and I enjoy not being an expert in anything and create this notion of being very open-minded. And I spend a lot of time reading and listening to other researchers, especially looking at how terminology is being used in different fields. They sometimes use the same term, but means very different things. And creating this type of knowledge, what I call hybridized knowledge. So hybridized knowledge is something that doesn't only apply in one field, but it applies to different fields, is from learning from different people. Next questions that are going on in my research group is, how do second language acquisition and literacy learning manifest in children, adolescents, and adults? So we've started to do a little bit of this behaviorally and using MRI. What are the classroom and pedagogical features that facilitate learning? Could be that just having more peers sharing the same linguistic background as you are facilitate learnings. And this is a type of work that's funded by the Department of Education in the US. We may not be able to do it in the full range, but it is what it is. How do we sensibly, equitably, and reliably identify bilingual children who may benefit from special education? Is a longitudinal study, a prospective design. We are in year 2 of a 4-year project right now, and we may not be able to continue. And the final, which is a line of work that I won't be able to share with you today, is what about other social factors? How do the cascading effects of perceived value of language diversity lead to differential development and learning outcomes? This is the work that we see. If parents value multilingualism, would they actually use more of the heritage language with their children? And if so, does that manifest in their behavior? So these are the 4 big questions that we're trying to ask. And if you just have to remember one thing in this talk, remember this figure where, yes, I come from these 3 fields. I kind of try to bring them together. But the important thing is to look at how an individual situated in different contexts and what's the language usage and language interaction in each of these contexts between the individual and her environment. Thank you.